In this video, I'm going to talk a bit more about Python variables, and specifically about the difference between local and global variables. A local variable is one which is defined inside a function. Let's look at an example of that. So in this code cell, I'm defining a function f. It has an input represented by a variable whose name is x, and on line 2, we create a new variable called y inside the function definition. So y is called a local variable for the function f, as is the variable whose name is x, which represents its input. And finally, on line 3, we return x plus y, so the input of the function added to 2. Let's see that this works. So we're going to call f of 1, and you can see the output is 3. 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. The key point about local variables is that they are not available outside the definition of the function to which they belong. If you try to refer to this local variable y, it will give an error. So here we see when I try to run this code cell which contains y, it'll tell me that the name y is not defined because this local variable y is not available outside the definition of the function to which it belonged. Global variables, by contrast, are ones which are defined outside of any function definition, and you can access those anywhere, including inside function definitions. So here in this code cell, we have a global variable called 10. I'm going to run this code cell so that the global variable z is defined. Next, we're going to define a function which, in its definition, refers to this global variable z. So our function is called g. It has a single input represented by a variable whose name is x, and it returns x plus z. So z here refers to the global variable defined above. When I call g of 1, that's going to be 11 because x has the value 10 and the input to the function g is going to be 1. So there we go, g of 1 is 11. But global variables can be slightly confusing at times because we could change the value of this global variable z. I'm going to change the value of z so that the name z now refers to the value 20. And we now have an interesting question, which is what is g of 1 going to be? At the time that we defined g, the value of z was 10, but we've just changed the value of z to 20. So what's going to happen? In fact, whenever you call g, it will look up whatever the current value of that global variable is and use that in its calculation of its output. So g of 1 is now 21. That can be quite confusing because we've just called the same function with the same input and got different output both times. So first g of 1 was 11, second g of 1 was 21. That kind of thing doesn't happen with mathematical functions, but it can happen with Python functions, and it illustrates why global variables can sometimes lead to confusing behavior. The same function was called twice with the same input, and we got different outputs both times. In fact, even more confusing things can happen when you mix local and global variables. Let's consider this example here. We have on line 1 a global variable called a. A has the value 1. And on line 2, we're going to define a function called h, which refers in its definition to a variable also called a. So on line 3, we put a equals 2. And then finally, we return a times x. And now here's some confusion because what were we doing here on line 3? Were we changing the value of the global variable, or were we creating a new local variable? In fact, what we're doing is creating a new local variable. So whenever you do a variable assignment like this one, with a single equal sign, inside a function definition, you create a new local variable and you don't modify the global variable, even if there is a global variable with the same name. So when I run this, well, h of 1 will of course be 2, so it will be 2 times 1, but the old global variable a has not changed. This will still have the value 1. So whenever you do an assignment inside a function definition, like we did just here, what you do is create a new local variable, and you don't modify a global variable, even if there was a global variable with the same name. So again, this can look confusing, and rather than simply learn what the rules are, the best advice I can give you is to avoid being in this situation. So don't use the same variable name to refer to two different things when that could possibly cause confusion. Python gives you a lot of flexibility in naming variables, so use that to avoid ambiguity.